Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scot McKay.
All right, how's it going, gentlemen? You're tuned in to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. As always, I am your host, Scot McKay from X and Y Communications. Today, we're going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to every man's heart, especially men of good character, and that is how to be the hero in your relationship. Now, I'm not talking about being a simp. I'm not talking about sawing off your balls and handing them on a silver platter to some woman who's just going to use you and abuse you. No, I'm talking about the reality of being a heroic man who women respect, your kids will respect, even in the workplace, on the softball field, in your bowling league, you'll be the man who's probably, well, definitely respected more because you understand how heroism really works. And with me today is a guest who is exactly the right guy to talk about that topic with. But before we get there, I want to remind you that you can find me all over social media, on X, on YouTube, on Truth Social, on TikTok, at Scot McKay, ScotMckay, at Real Scot McKay on both Threads and Instagram. And the website is mountaintoppodcast.com. The Facebook group, which you guys should all join, of course, is the Mountaintop Summit on Facebook. Ed Neeson lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where a lot of my family lives as well nowadays. He's a psychotherapist, and he's also the author of the appropriately titled book for such a discussion as we're going to have today, Song of the Hero. Ed Neeson, welcome to the Mountaintop, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, it's our pleasure. I think this is going to be a great topic. You have a long and storied career being a psychotherapist and an advocate mostly for men, and it fascinates me how you would come up with a title, Song of the Hero, based on your many travels and discussions with men all over the place. So tell me, what ultimately inspired you to sit down and write this particular book?
Yeah, I think essentially it's a couple of reasons, sort of line up with my career as a clinician, a psychotherapist, and personally, especially as a man in a marriage, where, long story short, I had the rude awakening that I was not the man that I could be in my marriage, and, going through struggles and challenges that, anyone could in a marriage. And so I went on this personal journey to really transform myself. And it was quite transformative, still is. So then I started seeing a lot of the guys that come to me in my psychotherapy capacity who were experiencing similar things. The issue with that is that you could say my personal path of transformation was a bit unconventional, where it really wasn't, as far as I knew, based on evidence-based practice. And as a psychotherapist, obviously you have to sort of operate within the bounds of evidence-based practice. And so I went into the research to really see how my journey could be supported or changed as far as like my perspectives of my journey. But all that in an attempt to be able to apply my experience in the psychotherapy capacity. And I started to see some pretty profound results with these men once I sort of underwent that part of the process. And then I thought, well, I need to write down sort of what's happening here, because I hadn't really seen much out there from a clinical perspective that aligned precisely with what I was doing. And I certainly wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel or be original for the sake of being original. So I just started writing down what was working. Long story short, what turned into, from a few pages of, here's what's working. And eventually I'm at somewhere between 50 and 80 pages. And I realized, okay, this is a book. And so that turned into a project. The short of that is, in some sense, I wrote the book that I needed because it really wasn't out there. I read lots of books about men in relationships, personal development as a man, and so many great books of that sort. But as really sort of personally, what did I need? And so that's sort of the gist of it. And it turned into quite a project. It's a little dense, very technical. I kind of call it my dissertation. I'm a psychotherapist. I have a master's degree and not a PhD, but this was much like a dissertation because of the amount of research that had to go into it and the integrity that I wanted to have with it.
Yeah, it's hard not to have integrity when you're talking about your own personal experiences and writing solutions for yourself. I mean, you wouldn't lie to yourself, I hope, especially as a psychotherapist. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you hope not anyway.
Yeah, right. So let's dig a little bit deeper into exactly what was going on. What were the warning signs? What were the goings on and perhaps not goings on in your own personal relationship with your wife that really signaled to you needed to change? And I guess it probably would behoove us all to hear what those changes were you made as a direct result. So go ahead and just riff on that. Let us know how that all went down.
Yeah, well, I like to say that I've always been a man of good character, at least for the most part of my adult life. And so when in my attempts to be a leader in my marriage as a man, I was met with a lot of not just resistance, but a lot of challenges. And quite frankly, it just wasn't working. I would not only get resistance, but it oftentimes seemed to make things worse, and the conflict would worsen and prolong, and then we would experience the same types of conflict. And I was frustrated because here I am, like I think I'm trying to be a good leader, but clearly I'm not only falling flat on my face, I'm sometimes making things worse, and I'm just not understanding. And in hindsight, my wife was right to resist those things, because what I learned was there was so much that I did not understand about my attempts to be a leader. So that was sort of the tipping point, if you will. So I decided to, like I said before, really take a deep dive and say, okay, let me back off. Let me reconsider everything. But yeah, just the challenges of conflict as a man, trying to contend with the challenges of a feminine woman, really not understanding the psychology of the masculine or the feminine, or the biology or the evolutionary psychology of men and women. Which is where a lot of my personal deep dive took me. But essentially, it's the feminine challenges and the struggles and the boundaries and managing conflict was just nowhere near what it could have been. And the more I tried, the worse it seemed to get. So I really had to sort of back up and take a deep, very difficult look at myself.
What you're talking about is a struggle that a lot of men not only face, but want to talk about. So this is good that this is coming up. Time and time again, I hear from men who say, look, I've been told I need to be a leader, a provider, and a protector, but it just seems like women don't want that. And a lot of times they'll blame it on the current state of affairs sociopolitically. Women, they'll blame it on feminism with a capital F, right? And they'll just say to every pundit or alleged expert out there who's talking the way you and I are right now that we're just wrong. We're living in the 1950s and women just aren't like this. Yet, when it's done right, there's this magical transformation, like a veil's been lifted. Then all of a sudden women respond powerfully to us in that leadership. And we go, wow, what do you know? I made a few tweaks. And since I'm the one leading here, I just needed to figure out how to lead differently. And then it worked. And certainly, of course, not with broken women or psychotic women who aren't in our reality with us. But, for well-meaning people, a man who leads, and of course, when a man does it according to the natural order of masculinity and femininity, as we talk about often on this show, by the way, the results tend to be a lot better than if we're just sort of winging it. And here's something I've noticed. Any man who's simply trying to do better at this is very, very likely already demonstrating high character in his life and as a man by doing so. Men who want to be abusive, men who want to be jerks, they don't even care about improving. Good grief. They just want to get what they want and steamroll whoever they're going to steamroll to get there, not even worry about it. So I've noticed, and of course you're welcome to talk about this as well, that if we have a wife or a significant other who loves us, and vice versa, of course, she'll at least appreciate the effort on our part to rise above these challenges and do a little bit better. Don't you think?
So the way that I would view that first and foremost is if you are trying to be a better man, a better leader in your marriage on the most fundamental level, it's an indication that you are oriented towards the transcendent good regarding the marriage and your own personal development and the well-being of your wife, so to speak. So what happens then is, what's the next fundamental level we can look at? And it's really the way that we perceive relationships, and as men, the way that we perceive women. And this kind of gets to a couple of probably fundamental concepts that I discuss in my book, and that is a big part of my work with men, is understanding the unconscious purpose or function with a woman's behavior. So that's one. The other is really to do with compatibility and conflict. And so we have a gross misunderstanding of the reasons behind a woman's behavior, and we can get into that. We also have a pretty skewed perception of what compatibility means in a marriage, and we really can understand woman's behavior probably easiest way through understanding personality psychology and evolutionary psychology. And there's a concept called commitment skepticism bias, which I would say that it's one of the central concepts of the book. And if you didn't listen to any more of what I had to say and you research that commitment skepticism bias, I think it could change your life.
So you're talking about women have this almost built-in archetypal, if you will, resistance to believing you're going to commit to her. If you come to her and say, hey, baby, I'm going to love you forever. You're my babe. Don't want nobody else, honey.
Yeah, it's an evolved psychological mechanism.
A protection mechanism.
Yeah, men and women have different biological vulnerabilities and obligations, if you will. You know, typically speaking, women are the weaker of the genders between men and women. They're more vulnerable when they're pregnant, more vulnerable when they're nursing, and like it or not, you are generally less attractive as a potential mate if you have another man's child. Now I get we're much more complex and evolved than that, but we can't outrun that biology. So they have this evolved psychological mechanism that defaults to assessing for false positives. He says he's committed, but if he's not, and I assume he is, I could be in big trouble. Now, if he is committed, and I assume he's not, there's a risk with that because maybe I miss out on a good man. But that risk is much more tolerable than the risk that comes with assuming he's committed when he's not.
Yeah, that sounds about right. That's in line with the other ev-psych stuff that I've heard in the past.
Yeah, David Buss has really sort of come up with that theory, and it's incredible work. And he's, I believe, the founder of evolutionary psychology. So great stuff to read up on there.
There's also that other minor inconvenience that we as men all understand, and it goes something like this. When a woman gets knocked up and she's pregnant, that gestation period takes up 9 months, and then she's nursing and taking care of a kid for the foreseeable future after the birth. Meanwhile, we as men can go knocking up as many babes as we want, just blowing a load here and there. And so the concept of pregnancy isn't quite the crisis situation, at least from an evolutionary perspective for us as men as it is for women. So women have a lot more of a primally protective view of their own sexuality, don't they?
Yeah, and you know, from that theory that I mentioned here, you can extrapolate a lot of useful insights. And, you know, so sort of my analogy here is, you know, back in the cavewoman days, the woman really never had any doubt in her mind as to whether or not her caveman was committed and fit for the job. As long as he provided for her and then their children, as long as he fought off the lions and tigers and bears, and as long as he fought off the other cavemen from trying to take his cave woman, well, there was no doubt in her mind that he was fit for the job. But if he gets eaten by a tiger, abandons his kids, or gets clubbed to death by another caveman, that's awful, but she still has no delusions about it. Well, I guess he wasn't fit for the job. We don't really live in those times anymore. Obviously, we live in a world that's, all things considered, probably safer than we've ever existed in. But it doesn't mean that the woman doesn't need to know. And so sort of this evolved psychological mechanism has to do with sort of their behavior. And if you've looked into the any men's movement, any sort of self-improvement as a man, you probably have come across the idea of how women test men and sort of what that means. Well, there's a lot of interesting psychology behind that. And I think a big part of that is the commitment skepticism bias theory. So kind of give you a personal anecdote here. Years ago, I may have, let's just say I'm a man and I do and say stupid things sometimes. And so that's, there was this time, I forget what it was about, but I said something that was hurtful to my wife. And being who she is, she rightfully called me out on it and was, upset about it and emotional about it. And, being the so-called good man that I was, I'm doing air quotes here, is that I owned it and I took responsibility for it. And then something happened, she says, and she pointed at me and sort of scowled, right, in her, deep emotional distress about the situation, and pointed at me and scowled and said, well, why did you do that in the first place? And I thought, well, I did hurt her. The least thing I could do is sort of explain myself to her. And I did. And while the argument ended, it was still a lot of tension. And, truth be told, I didn't really get the sort of love and affection that I had hoped for that evening. Just, wanted to, okay, I thought we moved on. The conflict is over. I took ownership. I explained myself, and it just wasn't there. So fast forward, I start learning about this stuff. And because I'm still a guy and I still do and say stupid things, say something that's hurtful to my wife, she calls me out. Sort of the same story, right? Is that take ownership of it. And again, it's some sort of aggressive way. She's like, well, why did you do that to begin with? And I thought, no, I'm not just going to submit to your aggressive demands here. Once we calm down and I feel like it, I might tell you about what happened. Now, do you think she liked that? Well, it's kind of a rhetorical question. No, she did not like that. But that ended the argument. And sometime later that afternoon, that evening, she comes back to me and lays her head on my chest and says, I'm sorry for being bossy earlier. I did not expect that. All I wanted to do was set a boundary earlier in the midst of that conflict. But in retrospect, what I realized is that there was something going on here. So if we break apart these two scenarios here, and I'll try to make this quick, is that in the first scenario, she verbally demanded an explanation. And I had my reasons, and I gave it to her. So what was essentially going on is that underneath the surface, she was really sort of seeing how I was going to respond to her aggressive demands. And in the first scenario, I did. That's not respectful, as we know, because of what it indicates. So with women, they really look at the implications of a man's behavior. Well, if he submits to this little woman's demands, what makes me think he won't submit to an outsider's demands who wants to do us harm?
Yeah, ye old, if you can't stand up to me, you can't stand up for me psychology.
Exactly. And, this is not any earth-shattering news. I get that. But what I think this really led me to was this deeper understanding of sort of what it means to be a hero in a marriage. And it isn't simply, passing a shit test, if you will, or what I call a character building test.
I would call those opportunities to act like a man. I would look at those as more of an opportunity than a challenge.
Yeah.
Semantics, I'm sure, but I think psychologically it's helpful to realize that if a woman is issuing what the pickup artist would have called a shit test, really what she wants is for you to pass it, not fail it. I think a lot of guys have a lot more cynical or even nihilistic view towards women issuing such shit tests, meaning like they're just trying to get rid of us and disqualify us. And I understand the ev-psych premise of women disqualifying guys who can't be the hero in the relationship. I understand that. But I think, especially in today's modern world where things are a lot more nuanced in terms of providing and protecting. Yeah, women have that primal need still, but how it's transmuted from our intention to her heart and her feelings and getting rid of these cognitive biases, or at least clearing them up or resolving them, is a lot different nowadays than simply, clubbing a saber-toothed tiger to death.
Yeah, indeed. So, but it's also the very opportunity for a man to develop himself psychologically. And, what you could say is the ultimate premise of my work in this regard is male psychological development in the context of marriage. And so it's those tests, if you will, but it's really sort of the whole complexity, whether it's the ambiguity of the feminine nature of women, that I don't care how, even discuss for myself, I don't care how much I understand all of this. I'm not immune or exempt from the frustrations that come with the feminine challenge. And it's how I respond to that on the deepest level. So those experiences are opportunities I think it's correct. There are opportunities for me to activate more potential for myself to, from a depth psychology perspective, to really sort of activate those unconscious processes of integration, of individuation from a Jungian perspective of becoming psychologically whole. And I think that, with that sort of comes this idea of the hero in the marriage. And, unlike Campbell's hero's journey, where it's more of the collective sort of external thing, I sort of derive a lot of my understanding from this from Eric Newman. He wrote a couple of incredible books, The Great Mother, and one is The Origins and History of Consciousness. And he was a student of Carl Jung. And so his take was more about the individual, the inner process, the psychological development aspect of that. And what we can find in that is that sort of the dragon to slay, if you will, is really sort of, within you psychologically. But transformation takes place on a stage. And there's numerous types of stages, and those stages are relationships. And I think marriage is the one relationship with the most implications. And so that's probably the most optimal stage on which we can develop ourselves. And that's where the idea of the hero within the marriage comes in.
Hey, quickly, would you do us a solid for those of us guys who aren't necessarily immersed in psychology to define what Jungian actually means? Because I think we've all seen that before. We know it refers to Carl Jung, but if we're not connoisseurs of his work, we may not know the short version of what that actually means. So go for it real quick.
Yeah, essentially, Carl Jung, his psychology really had to do with the psyche as a whole, and that consists of the conscious aspects of ourselves, obviously what we know of, and that's where the ego is. And then there's the unconscious part of ourselves, and there's sort of two parts to that. There's the personal unconscious and then the collective unconscious. We won't delve into the collective unconscious because that's a really deep part of the theory here. But the idea is that, as we become more integrated, we develop psychologically, is that we become more conscious of the unconscious part of ourselves, and we sort of assimilate those aspects that emerge from the unconscious into a more wholesome version of ourselves. And this is sort of where you get, maturation as an individual, but in this context, men. We talk about as we get older, men, we typically seem to sort of mellow out and calm down, but really we've taken all those aspects of ourselves, positive and negative, and we've integrated those into something more transformative, transcendent, if you will.
Fantastic. And we're probably, as a direct result of that, better leaders in our relationships as we get a little bit more seasoned. But yeah, I appreciate everything you just said. When you're talking about what's going on in our psyche, what's conscious to us and what's subconscious to us, all this id, ego, super ego stuff. I mean, I think we as guys can relate to that at a somewhat surface level. But what ends up happening in the relationship, like we alluded to earlier in the show, Ed, is that we feel like we're trying to be a hero. We want to be a hero, but then it comes out all wrong. And then she's nagging us. And really, the way I would land the plane in terms of a woman nagging us is she doesn't feel safe. She doesn't feel like you're being the masculine man who's providing real safety. So as you were talking, it occurred to me that I am willing to bet a lot of men really look at the concept of providing safety from a much more unidimensional perspective, a much more limited perspective, if you will, than I think maybe women would like for us to. And here's what I mean, and I'd love to get your comments on this. I think a lot of guys go, well, you know what, if I'm physically protecting her, if she's provided for, if she's got all her stuff, if she's fed, she's got a roof over her head, the aforementioned saber-toothed tigers and warring tribes aren't coming in and, raping and pillaging her house, I'm good. We Gucci, man. Mm-hmm. She's got what she needs, but she doesn't. And I'll tell you what popped into my mind as you were talking, because this is a great conversation, really considering the idea of not just providing and protecting a woman's interests, but being a hero. The semantics there, using the word hero, points almost automatically, if we got a brain in our head and we're thinking about this, to something a lot more psycho-emotional than just physical, logistical provision. Have you ever seen the movie Giant with Rock Hudson and a young, beautiful Elizabeth Taylor from about 1960?
I have not, actually.
Okay, well, It's a wonderful movie, but it's not a little short movie like you want to watch on a weekday. It's actually a great date movie. It would be a wonderful date movie. It's one of James Dean's 3 or 4 movies he's ever been in my opinion, his best. Okay. And, Rock Hudson is this Texas rancher, this big macho dude, rides horses and, he's a cow puncher and all that stuff. And at the beginning of the movie, he goes to Maryland to buy horses. And he meets Elizabeth Taylor, falls in love, and he brings this woman from the verdant countryside of, basically what's now suburban Baltimore to, the Dust Bowl of Texas, like the Permian Basin, I think is where it's set with, tumbleweeds and just flat dirt everywhere. And brings her to the ranch. And she is a fish out of water at first, in this environment. But this is one of those movies that rolls out basically about a 35 year span over the course of 2.5, 3 hours, right? And she becomes a tough Texas mama. And they have kids, and one of the kids basically wants to go into social justice work. If I remember correctly, the part's played by Dennis Hopper, of all people, a young Dennis Hopper. And And Rock Hudson wants him to be a chip off the old block and learn how to ride a horse and blah, blah, blah. And this is a little bit of a spoiler alert. But Rock Hudson's very set in his ways and very arrogant about being a cattle rancher when all around him, Texas turns into one big oil field. And that's where the money is. That's where the prosperity is. And as you might have already imagined, James Dean's character plays a big part of that happening around it. And, at the very end of the movie, the climax of the movie is despite Rock Hudson having fought to be a cattle rancher and trying to get his son to believe more like he does when he really just wants to be a social justice warrior, really promoting the cause of Hispanic people in Texas, right, who are being mistreated. He finally faces up to this guy who's an avowed racist and has a fight with him. And big old Rock Hudson gets knocked out by this guy in the diner who's the racist. He loses the fight, right? And what happens is Elizabeth Taylor says to him, I don't think you see it this way, but after all these years, finally today, you were my hero. And I believe that's the exact word she uses. And that's why what you were talking about caused me to happen to remember that movie. Because you see, being a hero wasn't only about being a physical provider and protector. Finally, Rock Hudson's character realized that protecting what was important to her and helping her stand up for her cause, whether he believed it or not, but helping her in that battle caused her to believe, I finally have a partner. I finally have someone who will protect my thoughts and my beliefs as well. And, that kind of straddles a fence, doesn't it? Because what if we've married a woman whose beliefs are different than ours? How can we help protect what's important to her while remaining in integrity with what's important to us so that we don't come off like a simp or something? Because I think that would have a deleterious effect on our ability to be a hero anyway. I don't know. Maybe the answer comes down to compatibility, like you alluded to earlier. But I think there's something to this dimension of a man protecting a woman's psychological interests and what's important to her, not just her physical interests. Am I onto something there?
Yeah, I think you are. I like the word optimal or optimizing, right? You're trying to create an optimal environment for her development, which also is the tricky balance to strike there is this also needs to be something that develops me, and it needs to be something that develops the marriage. And maybe that's the more transcendent thing there. But essentially, and I like the reference to the movie here, because I think it's also indicative of an element of sort of becoming the hero in your marriage, is that it seems like it's almost always a surprise of what the thing is that actually elevates you to hero status or brings that awareness to her. She acknowledges this verbally or with her behavior, her in relation to you. And so that's a pretty fascinating element I haven't thought too much about, because it's kind of an obscure dragon to slay, so to speak, because the feminine sort of represents chaos. It's creative, but it's destructive. But I think essentially what's happening here is you want to create this optimal place, and on a psychological development perspective, you're trying to bring her to consciousness of her own you might say, femininity, of her own development. And so, the hero story here is you slay the dragon, you cut the dragon up, and you retrieve sort of the true ancient feminine from the belly of the dragon, and that's what emerges. And it's your gift, but it's also her gift, and it's this beautiful process. And so, if we can sort of see the story as we try to understand, our woman's behaviors or our struggles, why can't we really sort of connect? Why are we struggling to create this optimal environment? Is that we sort of have to imagine, and I don't think we daydream enough. Insert that right there, but we have to allow ourselves to play out the imagery of our own heroic story and what that might look like, because it's not so clear if we just pay attention to the science and the superficial psychology of the thing. It's, what is my personal story in here? How is the things that I'm struggling with in this relationship, in this marriage, part of my myth, so to speak? And I think if we start to at least ask those questions and try to pay attention to that and imagine what that is, we can start making the connections with the superficial challenges that we have in our marriage, or just with our female partner here.
Yeah, ultimately, I believe that a lot of guys, we want to be powerful. We want to be influential. The person we want to celebrate our power and influence more than anybody else is the woman in our life. We want our coworkers and our dudes and our kids even to respect us and so forth. But when we love our wives, the great reward for whatever we're doing as men, to fight and battle, be warriors, whatever, is to have the woman appreciate it and recharge our batteries. Ask any man, and it's like, man, all I needed was a thank you for providing. We have these teenagers who, bless their hearts, don't understand this concept at all. And they get real entitled and like, hey, Dad, how about $50? And you just really want to whack them upside the head and go, you stupid kid, go get your own $50. You'll get nothing and like it, like the line from Caddyshack delivered expertly by, Ted Knight. But we don't want that. We didn't plan for that. We're trying to be a hero. But I think when we're being a hero on very concrete, left-brained, dare I say, masculine lizard-brained terms with a woman, she's going to respond with, great, but what about my feelings? What about what's important to me? And if we trivialize that and we're like, oh, well, you know what, whatever, at least I went to work and put food on your table. We shouldn't be surprised when she comes back and nags us a little about that. And then what happens is, I'm sure in many marriages that flares up into a tiff, if not a full-fledged argument, and they just miss each other. She's like, I needed more emotional protection, more emotional support, and you're simply all about paying the bills. The guy will, primarily respond with, yeah, you don't like that? Go get a job and pay your own bills. And we as men, if we really lead, if we really care about making the first move towards resolving everything we're talking about here today, we'll understand we're dealing with a female human being, and the masculine is to make her feel safe and comfortable on her terms. But we're the ones who make the decisions on how to go about that. And then what happens is, when a woman feels more holistically safe and comfortable like that, the end result is, well, a good woman will shower us with affection and sex and love and joy and comfort and make us a sandwich and all that stuff the feminists complain about. I think a lot of guys fail at it. I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's ever been easy, but it sure is natural. It's just we have a whole lot of things kind of clouding our vision nowadays from a societal, political perspective. But ultimately, we have to remember women are safety-seeking creatures, and that is mind, body, and soul, not just what's on the table and the roof over their head. Yeah, I think that's good stuff. I want to send these guys to your website, which is very simply edneeson.com. But if you go to mountaintopodcast.com/Neeson, guys, and that's with an E, not an A. So if you drive what was formerly known as a Datsun in the United States, man, I'm dating myself with that one. It's not a Nissan, it's Neeson, Nischen. You will be magically teleported to Ed's site. And what are they going to find there, Ed?
Well, they'll find out a little bit about me and maybe some of the things that I offer. And I have a few blogs on there that can really give you a peek into sort of the work that I do and sort of how I operate and the types of ideas and issues and complexities of the world that I like to explore.
Fantastic. And of course, right now, if you're listening to this episode within a few days of its release, especially, right there at the top of my Amazon storefront at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon, you'll also be able to grab a copy of Ed's book, Song of the Hero. That's there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. Ed Neeson from Charlotte, North Carolina, thank you so much for a fascinating and, dare I say, erudite discussion today about how to be a hero for the women in our lives. And I believe the guys appreciated it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Always love discussing this topic for sure.
Oh, yeah, it's a whole lot of fun. I could do this all day. Gentlemen, if you have not been to mountaintoppodcast.com, visit our sponsors, Heroes Soap Company. Hey, you want to be a hero? Start with a soap, right? Yeah, clean heroes are happy heroes and effective heroes, I guess. It just somehow seems appropriate for me to say that given the context of this particular episode, but I don't think I'm wrong either. Also, the Keyport, new faceplates all the time. That's what the guys at Keyport are all about, is having your 21st century everyday carry item, not your father's Swiss Army knife, right, guys? Properly outfitted with the latest interchangeable faceplate that you can put on front of it. Great stuff, great stuff. And of course, Jocko Willink's company, origin in Maine, American made, best jeans, best boots ever. A full line of supplements that are the best kind of supplements because they actually make you feel better and they actually work because they're easily absorbed and all natural. Origin in Maine, Origin Labs, always good stuff from Jocko and from Pete and from Brian and the other guys over at Origin. When you go to mountaintoppodcast.com, also download the free book, Sticking Points Solved, and get on my calendar for 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes with me to talk about whatever's on your mind. If it makes sense to put together a plan of action to get you better with women, we'll do that too. All of that and more is there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.